Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the merciful, benevolent, the source of all love and all support, Father and Mother, Creator, Sustainer of all the universes upon universes. You who are present within us and all around us, and yet who transcend all the universes, who are before the before and after the after. Bless us that we may speak the truth from our lips, that we may hear the truth with our ears and see the truth with our eyes. Ameen, Ameen, Ameen. Bihurmati Sayyid al-Mursaleen. Well, it's the first tape I've started with a blessing.
So if you can recount a couple stories that come to mind, your experience seeking, receiving, and following divine guidance.
The first thing that comes to mind, shortly after I was initiated as a sheikh or a guide in this tradition, our head sheikh in Istanbul said that part of your duties is to interpret dreams. That one of the gifts given to our order is that of dream interpretation, and that it's an important part of guiding dervishes in this path. And he basically recited a prayer and blew in my mouth. He said basically to recite certain surahs and to put myself at the feet of the founder of our order, and with that, from that connection to interpret dreams. And when I returned to California, I began interpreting dreams, and we all noticed that I interpreted dreams in a way that I had no idea I could, that I had never done before. So it was wonderful confirmation that something had happened. And in a sense, the process of dream interpretation really is to open oneself up to whatever guidance comes as the dream is being recited, and to add to that my conscious knowledge of who the dreamer is and what are the issues in their spiritual lives. And out of that things come. Often they're nothing that I would have predicted or that I would consciously have chosen to say, but really wisdom comes out of the dream. So that process is a process I've been now doing for roughly 15 years. Another place that I find guidance comes is in giving my weekly talks to our community here. I virtually always prepare the talks, sometimes write them down, sometimes just prepare them and outline in my head. But inevitably, some of what I say, if not the majority of what I say, is not what I plan. That there seems to be a living process of being present with our community, there's a sense of flow, that I feel I'm in a flow. And in that place, I trust what comes out. Our tradition, as with most Sufi orders, there's stress on the notion of a lineage, on a transmission lineage. And it's often called a chain, or silsila in Arabic. The image that I have is really, it's more like a pipeline. And that each teacher, in a sense, is another section of pipe. And that what's important in order for the pipeline to work is that my section really is connected well with my teacher. Otherwise, obviously, what flows through the pipe won't be transmitted, will leak out. So that my connection to the lineage, my connection to my own teacher, but really through my teacher to the entire lineage is important. And also that my length of pipe doesn't get a bunch of holes in it. That, there's a certain requirement of integrity in personal practice and personal attunement. And then what flows through me is really flowing through this pipeline. It's not mine. I can use my personal experience, but somehow the essential truth is really beyond my personal experience, even though my experience will find metaphors, words, ways of interpreting what comes through me. So it's an interesting balance in that what comes through me I really trust, and I can generally trust a simple interpretation of it, because I know that the essence of what is being taught isn't coming out of my head, is really coming from this other place.
Okay.
Number 2.
In your experiences that you talk about, how do you experience the guidance? Like, is it an inner voice? What is the quality of the experience?
It's more thoughts arising rather than a voice. I don't usually hear it as a voice, but just a thought comes to my mind. Well, this image in a dream means this. And I can also remember when one of our senior teachers, who's from New York, Sheikh Tosin, would come, and he would interpret dreams when he's here, because our tradition is whoever's senior does the work. And he always said, when our head sheikh is around, I really can't interpret dreams. You have to go to our head sheikh. But when our job is as halafeh, or as the representative of the teacher, when the teacher isn't around, we stand in his place, or her place. And I noticed when he would be interpreting dreams, as someone was telling a dream, often it was, oh yeah, that means that. And then I would wait and go, and then he would say, that means that. With exactly the same interpretation that came to me as I was listening. So and also often when people have asked me questions, critical questions, for major issues in their lives. For example, should I have this medical test or not, or should I adopt a child, or things like that. Inevitably, we've had the same answer. In one case I can think of where a couple said, should we adopt a child? And we both said yes, sure. They couldn't have children. And then they pretty much said, should we have a second one? And we both said no. And they did anyhow. And have found they really took on too much. I mean, one never, of course, wants to change. You're in love with your child, but there's really an acknowledgement that it really they've been sick, they've been exhausted, for the last 6 or 8 years, partly because they took on 2 kids of roughly the same age. Yet, I never, from my head, I wouldn't have predicted to say yes to one child but no to a second. I think having 2 children in general is a good thing. But in this case, it was interesting that we both were very clear that no, for whatever intuitive reason, it wasn't right. But again, to go back to your question, it really is not so much a voice as a thought, if you will. It doesn't feel voiced to me so much as just a thought comes to my mind. Mm.
If you could, now when I ask questions, if you could phrase the question in your answer. So
okay.
Like the next question would be, how do you discern what's coming from the source in this pipeline and what isn't? And if you can incorporate, for example, I discern what is from the source and that is, or something like that.
How can I discern or distinguish what comes through this transmission, through our lineage, through our pipeline, and what comes from other places? It's a good question. It seems to me that if it feels personal to me, then it's probably not coming through the pipeline. If it feels like I'm personally, emotionally invested, that it's hooked to my own personal life or my own personal personality values, then probably it's mine. And if it feels like something that really I'm not personally invested in, but it's something I've also heard from my teachers, and something that really comes in the moment as I'm trying to teach, as I'm trying to interpret scripture or something. I think there's a feeling of it's flowing through me, it's not coming from me. I certainly have a sense that, again, if I'm trying to teach and I'm emotionally hooked, it's going to be from me. It's not going to work nearly as well as if I'm able to stand back and, in a way, represent the tradition and let the wisdom of the tradition come through, as opposed to my own personal response to someone. Most of the time I can do it. But when I can't, I usually know it, because I usually fail spectacularly. I mean, there's also a sense of what works and what doesn't work. And I always remember many years ago Sheikh Muzaffer coming to ITP in 1980, 1981. And we were all getting into group process and speaking your truth. And he said to us, if I say anything from my guts, don't listen to me. And we go, wait a minute, we've been learning to do that. We've been struggling, to speak our truth, to speak from our guts. And he went on and he said, but you see, if I don't speak from myself, but something flows through me, then trust it. And it took me a long time, as I said, because I think we were so invested in what I would think of as maybe a humanistic model of what's in me is so important, my thoughts, my feelings. And this is much more, no, what are my thoughts and feelings worth? It's just my personality, and more often than not, absolutely wrong. But if something comes beyond me, and not distorted terribly much by me, then it's probably going to represent a deeper level of truth.
Do you access that guidance in your everyday life as well, in your personal life?
I wish I could say yes. Sometimes. I think that sense of flow for me is most there when I'm here in our tekka, in our center, when I'm teaching, and also when I'm teaching Aikido. It's there. Those are the two places it's clearest for me. Sometimes when I'm lecturing on other things, but mostly in those two areas do I feel it the strongest. I'm sure I could use it a lot more the rest of my life, but it seems to be, that process seems to be the clearest and strongest in those two instances.
Do you have a sense that in the pipeline is also this divine source as part of it?
Oh, absolutely. What is it that comes through the pipeline? Is it originally from a divine, in a sense, is the ultimate source of the wisdom that flows through our lineage, divine? And I have a lineage scroll. One of my dear old friends, Kenneth Roshi, showed me her scroll many years ago, her Buddhist scroll, and it's very, very similar. My scroll goes all the way up through the sheikhs, the teachers of our order, through many great Sufi saints, all the way to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, and in a sense his link was clearly to God. So in that sense, literally, I have a sense that we literally go all the way back, to Muhammad, and as a messenger of God, he was certainly, the first direct source for us of that wisdom.
check my question.
If I understand the question, it's, was there a call that brought me to seek guidance? Is there a process of seeking guidance in my life, and how did it start? And I would say, I would probably phrase it differently. I think I felt a call to seek God. In fact, I remember umpteen years ago, when I was in graduate school, we had rented an apartment, several of us, and there was one extra room that was, it was like a large walk-in closet, except it didn't have any hooks or hangers. And I said, well, let's just paint it white and it'll be a meditation room. And at this point, this was about 1964 or 3, I knew nothing about meditation, except I thought it was a good probably a really good thing to do. And then, I think it was about a year and a half later, I began to get involved with Aikido, and I read just a simple description of meditation, simple meditative practice. And I can remember just sitting in my dormitory room, kind of practicing watching the breath, with really amazing results. Once my mind and body got calm, I had this immediate sense of going within and going to another place, in consciousness, if you will. And that was very powerful, and as I learned different kinds of formal meditation techniques, I always felt early on what I got out of it was far more than the little bit I put in. And then over time it got more difficult. It was like a kind of a preview of coming attractions from God, which I found almost everybody has experienced. But I wasn't seeking guidance, I was really seeking God. I'm not sure that I was ready to take on the notion that I could be guided and run my life out of guidance or teach others out of guidance in those years. It seems to me the setup was I was a student and I knew nothing, and the Swamis knew things. And I was there to be guided by them, and I was there to be guided by scripture or by the writings of my teacher. There was no sense, I wasn't given any sense of authority or responsibility to do that for myself. Years later, and several spiritual paths later, I met Sheikh Muzaffer. And at the beginning I felt very much the same way. I felt that he was the guide, and I needed to learn a lot. It was a very rich, sophisticated tradition. And although he had said, and I've certainly heard it from Muktananda and other great teachers, that the real guru is within, Muzaffer Effendi said, well, eventually trust your heart. That when your heart opens up and you have access to the wisdom of the heart, that's what you should follow. But as a beginner, it was somewhat clear to me. I think he made it clear that one doesn't start there. One started by doing certain practices and learning things, and then eventually in this process the heart would open. Then, just historically, it so happened that when we were initiated in California, I was the first one to receive initiation. Why call? Who asked you to call? So, at the beginning it was clear that I was a student. My job was to learn from my teacher, to learn from the writings and scriptures of the tradition. But I also happened to have been the first one initiated in California, and by definition then I became the senior dervish in California, which is pretty odd because we were all totally new to it. But early on, I think within months afterwards, Tosin Effendi, who is the sheikh in America responsible for our whole group, said to me while I was visiting, well, I think things are not going well in California because you're not there. And part of me went, what do you mean that I'm not there? And it was like, you need to be there and lead them and guide them. And my initial response is, wait a minute, I'm having trouble leading and guiding myself. What's this lead and guide other people? But also when I first became a dervish, Sheikh Muzaffer gave me his own Haidariya, his vest. And although I've gained a lot of weight since, he was a huge, huge man. And it, looked like it would wrap around my body at least twice. And someone said, why don't you give him another vest, because yours is too big for him. And this is immediately after my initiation as a dervish. And he said, no, this is good for him. He can put his dervishes under it. So there was a hint there that first hour of my life as a dervish. And of course I kind of got freaked out and then tried to forget it. But I was then told, at a certain point, I told a dream to Sheikh Muzaffer, and he said, well, you should start doing some meditation and start lecturing to the dervishes in California. Well, nobody ever taught me any meditation, but I started lecturing. What I did was, with my professorial background, I read and I summarized what he wrote. That's as much as I felt I could do. And that lasted for a while, but slowly but surely, I guess I began to rely not only what was written, what I had heard, but somewhat synthesize those things for myself. And then, I think mostly after I became a sheikh, I began to rely more and more on my ability to lecture without simply repeating what was in a book, repeating directly what I heard, and began this sense of being able to follow a trust in my ability to follow guidance that came from our lineage. And as I said, after I had checked things with Tosin Effendi a number of times, and at first because I didn't know whether what I was following was right or wrong, so it was very reassuring for me when I would come up with an answer and part of me would go, where did you get that from? For him to say exactly the same thing. And that really confirmed my trust in whatever this process is. And now I know that I can give a lecture for an hour or whatever with no preparation at all if it comes up. I mean, I don't need that. I do it. The other night, for example, was the anniversary of the conception of the Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings upon him. And I really hadn't prepared anything. We were going to do some chanting. We were going to do a little ceremony. And we had 2 guests came. And I thought, well, I need to say something. And so I lectured, I don't know, for half an hour I give a talk. Now, much of it was stories I'd heard from my teachers, but much of it was kind of an interesting interpretation of, who is Muhammad and why is it important that we kind of love him and respect him, and what does he mean at different levels to us? And it just came because at that moment I thought, well, I need to say something, which I hadn't anticipated. So this process does happen, and I know it's available. I trust it.
Are there certain tools and practices you do to prepare yourself for that process, to work with that process?
In terms of tools or practices to prepare myself to receive guidance, I think it's an ongoing practice of letting go, of being open to what comes. As my sheikh said when he taught me about dreams, he said of metaphorically sitting at the knees, sitting at the knee of the founder of our order, if you will. So it's putting myself into a state of receptivity. It's letting go, of course, which is easy to say, not so easy to do, but in essence is simple. And my preparation, I think my preparation is my regular practice. I mean, praying, meditating, reading scripture, all those things are part of the practice of a dervish, not necessarily a sheikh. What I've been given as a sheikh is simply, in many ways, more to do, as opposed to anything totally different from what I did before. But I would say the main thing is really to trust that connection and in a way, to surrender to it, to let go of whatever it might be in me that would inhibit that flow from coming. So it doesn't feel like a lot of work. But as I said, I know I can, when I sit here in kind of this seat with this stuff on me, I feel I'm in that place. And it's easy. Similarly, it's easy when I'm on the Aikido mat in my Aikido clothes. It's not so easy when I'm being a father or a husband or a teacher in other courses necessarily. And I think more often than not I blow it, or at least I don't work from that same state of really clear flow that I trust. I think my head gets more in the way.
I have a question that's coming up for me.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience in the Sufi tradition, which is just in classes and stuff, in Sufi stories and poems, it feels like the stories and poems are guiding. It's like sometimes I'll read a story and it'll just penetrate my whole life. And I'm just wondering, is that part of the tradition that stories and poetry also are forms of connecting?
In the Sufi tradition, the question is, are the stories, the powerful stories and metaphors, parables of Sufism, the great poetry of Sufism, are they ways of connecting to this source, to this guidance? And I would say absolutely yes. I tell the same stories over and over again. I only know so many stories. But what's interesting is I'll often tell them with a different nuance because they're part of a different talk. They're part of another day. They're part of another holiday, and I find they're new. And the dervishes here who listen to me certainly say the same thing, that often they've heard a story now for the 5th time or the 10th time, and it has a different sense of meaning. And I think part of that is simply they're in a different place, and they bring more to the story. And also, to some extent, as I'm in a different place, I can bring them another layer of meaning of the story. And I think both are true. But at least the way our tradition works. See, I think Idris Shah did a very interesting thing, but very much outside the Sufi tradition, by simply collecting these wonderful stories and putting them with no context at all in a bunch of books. And as I understand, at least our particular piece of the Sufi tradition, which is only one order from one country, out of hundreds of orders from hundreds of different countries, we tend to use stories not separate from the rest of what's going on, but very much, someone asks a question, the story is part of an answer to that question. If I'm trying to teach a particular point, often a story will come, this sheds light on this point. And often the stories are richer in that it doesn't just shed light, it's not just one answer or one piece, but the story itself is multidimensional. But in particular, I'll introduce it, it's coming in with a particular context, never contextless, like here's a piece of wisdom from the Sufi tradition. For example, one of my favorite stories is about the importance of practice. And when I talk about knowledge and, not just taking in knowledge, but how important it is to practice what you've learned, I love to repeat the Nasruddin story. I always love the Nasruddin stories anyhow. There's one that Nasruddin is functioning as a judge, and the mother comes to him with a little boy, and she says, Nasruddin, could you please tell my boy not to eat sweets? He's just got this horrible sweet tooth. And, anytime I make anything in the house that's sweet, he'll steal it. It doesn't ever get to the dinner table. He'll swipe the honey and the sugar, and, every dessert I make, I have to lock up if I ever want to get it to the dinner table. Nasruddin thinks, and he says, okay, come back in 2 weeks. So she comes back 2 weeks later, and he kneels down and looks eye to eye with the boy, and he says, young man, I know you can do this. Use your willpower. Control that desire for sweets in you. You can do it. Go home and do that. And he gets up, and the mother says to him, Nasruddin, why did you have me come here now? It was a long trip. Couldn't you have told him that 2 weeks ago? And Nasruddin says, absolutely not, he says. See, I have a sweet tooth, and until I controlled it in myself, I couldn't tell him to. So, I mean, it's a great story out of context in many ways because that issue is an interesting fundamental issue. But in context, it's a very useful story. It's just a reminder that book learning and that kind of intellectual knowledge has no force unless it's really backed up by one's own personal experience and the reality of one's own life and practice. So, I mean, there are many levels of that. I've also used it as a window on the difference between Western scholarship and the kind of wisdom that Sufi teachers try to experience. And that Western scholarship just takes it for granted you're probably not going to practice what you're writing about. And yet I think the Sufis, as with much of the Eastern traditions, if you don't live it, it's not worth anything. The words are hollow. They're meaningless. They have to come from lived experience. So very much, I'll use that story in a bunch of different related contexts. And I don't ever get tired of telling it, so I figure people shouldn't get tired of hearing it. But I do think people do come away with a sense that the story does teach them in a kind of direct way, and speaks to them. And as I said, if you hear the same story a number of times, and you suddenly it opens something, it's pretty clear that what's opening is some intuitive connection with guidance. It's not just obviously the words of the story, but something that it's opened in you that wasn't opened a month ago or a year ago. So, but I do more than the Sufi classes or than just reading the books would do. I always kind of provide some sort of a context and some interpretation of the stories because that's what I do.
Okay, pause a moment and I just want to check out my senses as we're talking that is it true that you mostly use this process of guidance when you're helping others? Or do you use it in some situations for yourself, like, if you have a big, major decision to make, do you use guidance in that? Or try to?
The question is, to what extent do I use guidance in my own life, and to what extent is it mainly focused on helping others? My sense is I use it mostly in teaching, that in my role as a teacher, somehow I can call on that easily, for whatever reasons. I think I also do get guidance about my own life. Part of the problem is, however, I'm usually too attached to the issues. I think it gets muddled more for me when it's my own issue. So I may say, yeah, that's what I should do, and then a rationalization will come in. Well, let's look at other sides, which I don't do when I'm dealing with other people because I'm not attached to the issue. So frankly, I think I'm much better. I think it works better for me as a teacher than in my own life, which is why I often don't think of myself as a highly developed teacher.
When you talk about your first experience with Sufism and your teacher coming to IPP, and it seemed like from reading it in your book and stuff, and I've heard you tell it a couple of times, I perceived almost that there was a sense of calling, like there was this pull, a guiding force that was pulling you in. Is that true? Are you feeling a personal pull into this?
Certainly my very first meeting with my teacher very much had this sense of a calling or a personal pull. That when Sheikh Muzaffer came to ITP, he was invited by Jim Fadiman, not by me because I had never met him and didn't know much about Sufism at that point. And I didn't know who he was. He walked by my door and kind of glanced into the room and walked by without breaking stride. So his glance lasted for a fraction of a second. And at that point, time stood still for me. It was just this amazing sense of timelessness. And I had this clear feeling that all the data of my life was like being squirted through a high-speed modem into a mainframe computer. I thought maybe the big, like the biggest computer at Stanford or Berkeley or something huge. And that computer was so good it could take all that data, integrate it all, and know how everything was going to come out, including the phone call. And at that point I did hear a little voice, which I normally don't hear voices, and the voice said, I hope that was the head teacher, because if that was one of his students, I don't want to meet this guy's teacher. This was heavy, kind of heavy enough. But there was an unexpected instant connection that clearly was not about my intellectual expectations or any of my personal history stuff. Whatever this was going on at another level. And I'm not sure I would call it guidance. It was certainly a connection. It was a calling, it was a connection first to him personally. And then over time, as I listened to him, I became deeply connected to what he taught and to the people around him. And so it all deepened. But the initial connection was much more very deep personal connection with him. And again, in our tradition, that is often how you start. It's often said that the way to start, you start Sufism is falling in love with a sheikh. You fall in love with a teacher, and you are willing to give your spiritual life to that teacher's guidance, into that teacher's hands. And that's one of the few good reasons why one should, in a sense, become a dervish, become a Sufi, and in a sense submit to a teacher as if you love and trust them to that extent. So that really is, how it started, with that fascinating experience. And again, the interesting thing was I had absolutely no expectations. I didn't even know who it was that passed my door. All I knew is he had a white hat on like this, and he had a mustache, and he didn't look like the average people that walked by my door. I knew he was one of the Turkish Sufi visitors, and that's all. It was all I knew until time stopped.
Another question coming up for me is, you talked about submitting and letting go, and I know there's in Sufi stories and poetry, there's a lot of the idea of surrender. Could you talk a little bit about that process in Sufism, in your tradition, in terms of my sense is you're talking about if you submit to the teacher, is it also by submitting to the teacher you're submitting to this higher source too, and through that?
Sufism and Islam talk about submission. And the question really is, what is that process? And what is submission to a teacher? Is submission to a teacher really also submission to the divine? In our tradition, submission is often put, it's submission of your little will, your personal will, to divine will. Which doesn't mean anything, since it's hard to know what is personal will and what is divine will. One way of thinking about it is, in a way, can I submit those personal, neurotic things in me that want me to make certain decisions for my own selfish benefit, or that are conditioning me to understand or to decide based on my own personal history or my own personal biases, and get in the way of that flow really working well. So in a way, submission is to get the personal out of the way and let that which is far greater come through, in the sense of connecting it back to guidance. Submission to a teacher in a sense, is submission, the beginning of submission to one's whole lineage, which is the beginning of submission to the divine. In fact, it's said, the end state is called fana, or very much like nirvana, and maybe the vana, and fana are etymologically related. I don't know, but fana really means, again, to extinguish, to become nothing. And it said you start with fana fi sheikh, to surrender, to dissolve in your teacher. And then it's fana fi pir, to dissolve in the founder of your order. And then fana fi rasul, to dissolve in the prophet, peace and blessings upon him. And then finally fana fi la, to dissolve in God. In one sense, to dissolve in one sheikh, I think practically means to identify with the teacher, to know the teacher's values, to know the teacher's mind, so that you can virtually answer with the words your teacher would use even without your teacher present. And again, I'll never forget early on, the first visit, I think, of the dervishes, there was a problem in the kitchen. We, the ITP students, were making food 3 meals a day for the dervishes and struggling to try to make good food that Turks would like. These were men who hadn't traveled a great deal. They were really used to their own kinds of meals, their own style of cooking, and we tried to do well by them. But there were some struggles in the kitchen with who was in charge and all that stuff. And so then, of course, some of the Turks who were incredible cooks wanted to come help out. And then the students, were, well, no, but we have to serve, But so at one point, the man who was the translator for the sheikh came in and he looked around and he gave this incredible talk on the nefs, on this lower personality and the ego, and how the ego wants to take credit. And he said, ideally, you should serve for the sake of service, and it shouldn't matter who serves, as long as people are being served well, but how the ego won't let you do that. And it was the most exquisite talk on the ego and on service and on how these things work together. And yet there wasn't a word that was wasted that was irrelevant to the situation in the moment in the kitchen. And I said to the translator, I think you blew it. You're not just a translator. That was really the most incredible talk I've heard on these critical core things in Sufism. He said, no, I'm the translator for Muzaffer Effendi. He's just not here now, but those are his words. And of course the translator was Tosin Effendi, who has been my sheikh and guide, the senior sheikh in America for many years. But at first his role was that of the translator to the sheikh, not of being a sheikh in his own right. And he was an impeccable translator in that role. And so I think that's a wonderful example of, in a way, submission or kind of dissolving in one sheikh, to be able to say, ideally, what I teach is what my sheikh would say. If he's not in the room, I have a level of trust and understanding of who my sheikh is, that I can simply repeat his words, or be a channel for his words. That's a good story.
Yeah. Is there anything else you feel you'd like to say?
Well, it's interesting. Many years ago, probably 10 years before I met Muzaffer Effendi, I went to India. And I was there at a conference on the scientific study of yoga. All kinds of people were there, Tibetan Buddhists and yogis and Sufis, and I met a man who called himself a Sufi. I had no idea what in the world was a Sufi about that at that time. And in India, they all sound alike. I mean, everybody uses the term gurus and chakras. And I remember I sat with him, and he said to me at one point, he said, you have light. You have just you feel yourself surrounded in that light and teach from that light, act from that light, just do it. And I thought, gee, that's nice. And it was inspiring, and then a part of me thought, that's too simple. How can I do that? I mean, that's much too easy. And I reflected, it's taken 20, 30 years that, in fact, it is that simple. When one gets to the place that one can do it, that to the extent I can remember I'm in that light, or put myself in a role like this in which somehow part of the role is being in connection, being in a sense of flow with that, then it does happen. But as I said when I first heard it, my definition of myself was as a student, and a student is not one who gets the light for themselves, or you have to get it from a teacher and struggle and be in darkness. So I mean, it's an interesting gloss that, in one sense, I was really empowered to use guidance and to follow guidance only after I was initiated as a teacher. And I really think part of the implicit definition of the role of student is that you give all that power to somebody else. And that's, looking back on it, I didn't realize it at the time, but I think that's one of the problems with many traditions. Or it may be that when one is a student, one isn't ready, that there's too much personal stuff in the way, and that maybe it is at the beginning, that one is only ready to be a teacher when one is ready to follow and able to follow that guidance without much distortion. I think that's probably true too. It's said in the Sufi tradition that when you're ready, mature spiritually, a child of the heart is born. And it said, unfortunately, this sounds chauvinist, so we could cut it out if you want, but it said if the child is female, it means you are to nurture yourself, and the guidance and the wisdom is for you. I think with the notion that the woman is more concerned with the inner, with the home, with the nurturing within the family. And if the child is male, then you're destined to become a teacher, and that guidance is also to be used for others. So that it's in the Sufi tradition, one gets to a certain place, and then there's this subtle difference in the dervishes whose heart wisdom is to be used for self-nourishment, and the dervishes whose heart wisdom is to be used in teaching. So.
Have you experienced that birth?
No. I mean, not in any way that makes sense. It's a beautiful metaphor, but I certainly haven't experienced anything as dramatic as a birth of an inner child. As I said, I've experienced guidance. I've experienced a connection to and a willingness to follow guidance. But I'm afraid I can't honestly say I've had anything as dramatic as an inner birth.